Before the British Empire unleashed its systematic cruelty across the globe, there was one place where it refined its methods of oppression: Ireland. For centuries, Ireland served as a testing ground for policies that would later be applied across the British colonies. These included land confiscation, the imposition of English law and language, suppression of local culture and religion, and the use of military force to quell resistance. The English crown's efforts to subdue Ireland began in earnest in the 12th century, but it was during the Tudor conquest in the 16th century that systematic oppression truly intensified. The atrocities that the British would later inflict upon Africa, Asia, the Americas, and beyond were first practiced on the Irish. The people of Ireland were the initial victims of an empire that would go on to leave a trail of blood and suffering on every continent it touched. Its ideology of racism and dehumanization was honed right in Ireland. Despite the Irish being a European people who had contributed immensely to intellectual history, they were consistently dehumanized in British speech and writing. For centuries, British writers and politicians depicted the Irish as a backward, savage race, almost a different species. They were described as wild, uncivilized, and incapable of self-governance. This narrative served a dual purpose. It dehumanized the Irish, making it easier for the British public to accept the harsh policies imposed on Ireland, and it provided a moral justification for the British conquest and colonization of Ireland. The Irish were portrayed as a people in need of British civilization, a narrative that would later be replicated in other parts of the British Empire. This treatment laid the groundwork for how the British Empire would later view and treat other colonized peoples. When the British turned their attention to Africa, India, and the Caribbean, they deployed the same rhetoric of racial superiority. Africans were described as savages who needed to be tamed and civilized by the superior British race. Indians were seen as weak and effeminate, requiring British control to bring order and progress to their society. This was despite the fact that civilization in India and Africa long predates English civilization. Just as the Irish were denigrated and deemed less than human, so too were the Africans, Indians, and other colonized peoples. The same language of racial superiority was used to justify slavery, economic exploitation, and political repression. The British saw themselves as the bearers of civilization, a justification that allowed them to strip entire peoples of their rights, their lands, and their humanity. But just as the Irish resisted this dehumanization, so too did Africans, Indians, and countless others across the British Empire. Ireland was the first stage where the British Empire displayed its appetite for blood. The massacre at Rathlin Island in 1575 saw the brutal slaughter of 600 MacDonald clansmen, women and children by English forces under the command of the Earl of Essex. Later, the siege of Drogheda in 1649 under Oliver Cromwell was a gruesome showcase of British brutality. Cromwell's forces slaughtered nearly 3,500 people, including soldiers and civilians, men, women and children, after they had surrendered. These massacres were not just acts of war, they were calculated moves to break Irish resistance to English rule. The brutality displayed at Rathlin Island and Drogheda would become a template for British actions elsewhere. Consider the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar, India, in 1919. British troops, under the command of General Reginald Dyer, fired upon an unarmed gathering of men, women and children, killing around 379 and wounding over 1,000 more. Dyer's rationale echoed Cromwell's. He intended to teach a lesson to the Indian population. The parallels with Rathlin and Drogheda are stark, a deliberate act of mass murder used as a tool of repression. The legacy of British atrocities began in Ireland and was perpetuated across its empire, casting a long shadow over its former colonies. These brutal tactics were not an aberration, but a fundamental aspect of how the British maintained control over their vast empire. Understanding the role of Ireland as the testing ground for these methods is crucial to comprehending the full scale of the empire's global impact. The British Empire's insatiable hunger for land and resources was first satisfied in Ireland, where it began a systematic campaign to dispossess the native Irish of their ancestral lands. The plantations of Ulster, beginning in 1609, were the most significant and brutal example of this policy. This was not just about acquiring land. It was about erasing a people, uprooting their culture and replacing it with a foreign loyal population. The The British Crown confiscated vast swathes of land from the Irish nobility, redistributing it to English and Scottish settlers. This wasn't just an act of theft, it was a calculated attempt to undermine the social and cultural fabric of Irish society, ensuring that those who remained were left disenfranchised, marginalised and dominated by the new Protestant ruling class. The dispossession didn't end in Ulster. The practice of forced displacement and land grabs, first honed in Ireland, would soon be exported across the British Empire. In the American colonies, Native American lands were systematically seized, with treaties often broken or ignored. The British approach to indigenous land in North America mirrored the tactics used in Ireland: divide, conquer and colonize. The native populations were pushed further and further west, their lands taken and their way of life destroyed. In India, the permanent settlement of 1793 was another iteration of the land-grabbing tactics developed in Ireland. Under this policy, millions of Indian peasants were reduced to tenant farmers, bound to the land they once owned and forced to pay exorbitant taxes to British landlords. This policy led to widespread poverty, as Indian farmers were unable to sustain themselves under the heavy tax burdens imposed by the British, echoing the economic exploitation seen in Ireland. The same ruthless approach was applied in Australia, where the British embarked on one of the most brutal campaigns of land theft in history. Declaring the continent terra nullius, land belonging to no one, the British systematically displaced the indigenous Aboriginal populations. Their lands were seized, declared Crown land, and those who resisted were often met with violence and death. The echoes of the Ulster plantations could be heard in every corner of the Australian frontier, where the indigenous peoples were stripped of their land, culture, and lives. The architects of these land thefts were often the same men who had honed their skills in Ireland. Figures like Sir Arthur Chichester, who played a key role in the Ulster plantations, went on to influence land policies in other colonies, spreading the practice of dispossession like a plague across the empire. What started in Ireland as a calculated act of colonial greed became a global epidemic, leaving millions displaced, dispossessed and destroyed in its wake. Long before the British Empire set out to obliterate cultures across the globe, it began by crushing the spirit of the Irish people. The penal laws, introduced in the late 17th century, were designed not just to control, but to annihilate Irish identity. These laws stripped Irish Catholics of their rights, banning their education, restricting their worship, and even denying them the right to own land. The goal was clear: to erase Irish culture, language and religion, and replace it with a loyal, subservient populace that would bow to British rule. This systematic cultural suppression was the prototype for the Empire's tactics in other parts of the world. In India, the British imposed English as the language of education and governance, marginalising local languages and cultures. The British actively suppressed Indian traditions, labelling them as barbaric, while imposing their own values and systems. In Canada, the British government and church-run residential schools tore Indigenous children from their families, forcing them into institutions designed to kill the Indian in the child. These schools were tools of cultural genocide, where children were forbidden from speaking their native languages, practicing their religions, or maintaining their cultural practices. The scars of these policies are still felt today, as entire generations of Indigenous peoples were brutalised in an effort to erase their identities. The British Empire's economic exploitation was first perfected in Ireland, where the greed of the Crown sowed the seeds of famine and death. The Great Irish Famine of 1845 to 1852, one of the darkest chapters in Ireland's history, was not just a natural disaster, it was a man-made catastrophe, engineered by British policies that prioritised profit over people. As the potato blight ravaged the crops, the British government continued to export Irish grain and livestock to England, leaving millions of Irish men, women and children to starve. This was economic exploitation at its most brutal, where human lives were expendable in the pursuit of wealth. This cold indifference to human suffering would be replicated in India, where British policies caused devastating famines. The Bengal famine of 1943, in which an estimated 2 to 3 million people died, was the direct result of British economic policies that prioritised war efforts and exports over the survival of the Indian population. Just as in Ireland, the British extracted resources from the land while the local population starved. Figures like Charles Trevelyan, who played a significant role in the Irish famine, would later influence British economic policies in other parts of the empire, ensuring that the suffering inflicted on the Irish would be repeated elsewhere. The economic exploitation and engineered famines that began in Ireland became a hallmark of British imperial rule, leaving a trail of death and devastation across the world. The British Empire's approach to political dissent was forged in the crucible of Irish resistance, where the brutal tactics that would later be exported across the globe were first perfected. The Crown recognised that to maintain control over the Irish population, it would need to crush any and all opposition with an iron fist. The Croke Park Massacre of 1920 during the Irish War of Independence is a chilling example of this strategy. British forces, without warning, opened fire on a crowd of civilians attending a Gaelic football match, killing 14 and wounding dozens more. The tactics of repression honed in Ireland did not stay confined to its shores, but were exported throughout the British Empire. For instance, in India, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919 saw General Reginald Dyer, who had previously served in Belfast, where he gained experience in riot control, order his troops to fire on a peaceful gathering in Amritsar, killing hundreds. Dyer's actions in India reflected the same brutal logic used in Ireland to instill fear and break the spirit of those who dared to challenge British rule. Similarly, in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s, the British response was equally ruthless. In response to the Kenyan people's struggle for independence, British forces employed some of the most brutal tactics seen in the 20th century. Under the leadership of figures like General Sir George Erskine, who had experience in Ireland, suspected rebels were rounded up, tortured and executed, while entire villages were burned to the ground. Thousands of Kenyans were massacred, and many more were subjected to torture, forced labour, and imprisonment in concentration camps. The atrocities committed during the Mau Mau uprising were not the result of a few rogue officers. They were the outcome of a systemic approach to imperial control that had its roots in Ireland. The officers who carried out these atrocities were often veterans of the Irish conflicts, where they had learned and refined their techniques of repression. The roots of British exploitation of human labour can be traced back to Ireland, where the seeds of inhumanity were first sown. While the transatlantic slave trade is often the most recognised symbol of British involvement in slavery, the exploitation of Irish labourers set a grim precedent. The British practice of indentured servitude began with the forced transportation of thousands of Irish men, women and children to work in the colonies. These individuals were treated as little more than property, their lives expendable in the pursuit of profit. This early system of human exploitation served as a precursor to the massive scale of slavery that the British would later oversee in the Americas and the Caribbean. As the British Empire expanded, so too did its appetite for cheap, exploitable labour. In the Caribbean, the British established a brutal system of chattel slavery, forcibly transporting millions of Africans across the Atlantic to work on plantations under inhumane conditions. The exploitation of Irish indentured servants laid the groundwork for this system, with the British perfecting their methods of control, punishment and dehumanization on the Irish before applying them on a larger scale. The British Empire's legacy is stained with the blood of countless atrocities, many of which can trace their origins back to Ireland. The brutal tactics employed during the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland in the 17th century, where entire villages were razed to the ground and civilians were slaughtered indiscriminately, set the stage for the war crimes that would later be committed across the globe. The policy of scorched earth, used by Cromwell to deprive Irish rebels of resources, was a precursor to the same tactic being used in other conflicts where the British sought to crush resistance by any means necessary. In the 20th century, these same methods were applied during the Second Boer War in South Africa. The British implemented a scorched earth policy, burning farms, destroying food supplies and forcing civilians, mainly women and children, into concentration camps. The conditions in these camps were horrific, with tens of thousands dying from disease and starvation. The war crimes committed in South Africa were a direct continuation of the tactics first developed in Ireland. Ireland was more than just a colony. It was the British Empire's laboratory of terror. Many of the atrocities that would later scar the world were first refined on Irish soil. The massacres, the forced displacements, the cultural suppression, the engineered famines, the ruthless political repression, the exploitation of human lives, and the heinous war crimes. These were all practiced in Ireland before being unleashed on countless other peoples across the globe. The story of British imperialism is not just a story of conquest, it is a story of systematic cruelty, refined and sharpened over centuries, with Ireland as the testing ground. The suffering of the Irish people laid the foundation for the empire's expansion, serving as a grim blueprint for the horrors that would follow in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and beyond. But this story is also a warning. The tactics of repression, the dehumanization of entire populations, and the relentless pursuit of power at the expense of human life did not end with the fall of the British Empire. The same methods can be seen in modern forms of oppression and exploitation. The legacy of the British Empire's atrocities, first practiced in Ireland, is a stark reminder that the pursuit of empire comes with a terrible human cost. As we remember these atrocities, we must also recognise the resilience of those who suffered under them, the Irish, the Indians, the Africans, and so many others who resisted and endured. Their stories are not just tales of victimhood, but of survival and defiance in the face of overwhelming brutality. Let this video serve as a testament to the truth that every empire, no matter how powerful, is built on the suffering of others. And let it be a call to ensure that such horrors are never repeated. The first victims were the Irish, but their suffering echoes through history, a warning to us all.